Welcome to the chapel by the sea. Good evening, and welcome once again to Tranquil Arc Chronicles, where history whispers through candlelight, and sleepless souls drift gently into the quiet abyss of forgotten centuries. Tonight, we travel to a place where the wind itself sounds like a prayer, and the sea never stops weeping. There, upon the jagged cliffs of Cornwall, stands what remains of Saint Morwen's chapel, a lonely stone sanctuary, perched against storms and centuries, its roof half swallowed by ivy and salt. The waves strike the rocks below with a rhythm that sounds almost human, a cry, a breath, a heartbeat. Inside this chapel, they say, the walls once shone with color, saints and angels rendered in such light that even sailors could glimpse their halos from the shore. But time, dampness, and despair dimmed their faces. Their eyes faded, their wings blackened, their smiles drowned beneath centuries of grime. Until one winter, in the year of our Lord 1482, a painter named Tomas Valen arrived from the mainland, quiet, devout, and pale as milk, with brushes wrapped in linen and pigments stored like relics. He came with a promise to restore the chapel's glory. But what he found beneath those ancient frescoes was no miracle. It was a revelation, one that would steal his sleep, his reason, and finally his soul. Tonight, as the storm rages outside your window and the walls breathe softly in the dark, make yourself comfortable. Draw your blanket close, let your eyes rest, and listen to the sound of bristles against wet plaster, the slow scrape of a blade lifting centuries of paint, and the faintest whisper of something that should never have been uncovered. This is the Painter of Saint Morwen. The arrival at the edge of the world, the sea, was not meant to be painted. That was the first thought that crossed Tomas Valen's mind as the cart lurched along the cliffside road toward Saint Morwen's Point. The sea was a living thing, vast, jealous, endless, and no pigment could ever capture its depths. Yet, as he squinted through the mist, he couldn't help but imagine which shade of green might best match the light curling off the waves below. Perhaps malachite ground with oil, or perhaps something darker, the color of wet sorrow. It was near dusk when the cart rattled past the last living tree. After that, there was only heather, rock, and wind. A single gull wheeled above the cliffs, its cry lost to the surf. The driver, a stooped man in a salt-stained cap, hadn't spoken since dawn. He only spat now and then, muttering to himself as though to keep something unseen at bay. When the road finally ended, it did so not with ceremony, but with a shudder. The horse stopped of its own accord. Before them, the cliff stretched into emptiness, and upon it, crouched like a gray animal, stood Saint Morwen's chapel. It was smaller than Tomas had expected. The roof had partially collapsed, and the bell tower leaned against the wind like a drunk. Yet even in ruin, there was something reverent about it. The stones glimmered faintly where moss had overgrown them, and a single window burned with a reflection of the sinking sun, like a candle trapped in glass. The driver refused to go closer. "You'll walk from here," he said, his voice a coarse scrape. Tomas blinked. "It's only another quarter-mile." "Aye," the man replied, already turning the cart, "and yet too near for my liking. I'll wait for you in the village if you're back by sunrise." Tomas smiled faintly, though the man's tone unsettled him. "You think I'll be devoured by ghosts?" The driver spat again, flicked the reins. "No, sir. Ghosts don't eat. They only paint you in." The cartwheels rattled away into the fog, leaving Tomas alone with his satchel and the sea's unending hiss. He walked the rest of the way, his boots crunching on gravel, slick with mist. The air smelled of iron and salt. Somewhere below, waves struck stone with the rhythm of a heartbeat. When he reached the chapel doors, great slabs of oak carved with faint spirals, he paused. A single drop of water fell from the arch onto his brow, cold as a blessing. He pushed the doors open. The scent met him first: damp plaster, mold, and old wax. The air inside was thick, as though the room had been holding its breath for 100 years. In the fading light, he could just make out the altar, veiled in dust. The walls, his true canvas, were shrouded beneath grime and soot, but here and there he glimpsed the outline of color: the blue of a robe, the gold of a halo, the curve of a saint's hand. He took one slow step forward. The sound echoed far too long. When he was halfway to the altar, a whisper of wind rose from the rafters. No, not wind. Voices, very faint, very old, like parchment being turned. He froze. It faded. Tomas exhaled. "The sea," he murmured. "Only the sea." But the sea could not whisper in Latin that night. Tomas set up his easel in the chapel's side chamber, what had once been the sacristy. He unpacked his brushes, his mortar and pestle, the small jars of pigment that glimmered like jewels under lamplight. Vermilion, ochre, lead white, a small vial of lapis, precious and costly. He would use it sparingly, for heaven itself. The villagers had told him the chapel was cursed, that no priest had stayed past one mass in 100 years, that the saints inside had eyes that followed you in the dark. Tomas had smiled at the rumors. He believed in craft, not curses. Yet now, as he mixed his paints and listened to the wind clawing at the shutters, he found himself glancing toward the chapel door again and again. He told himself it was the sea making that sound, that slow dragging noise, as of something heavy shifting along the floor. He told himself that, and when he finally lay down upon his cot, he prayed softly in words he hadn't used since childhood. "Saint Morwen," he whispered, "keep my hands steady." At dawn, he began. The first stroke of the scraper peeled away a century of grime. Beneath it, color emerged like flesh beneath scab. A robe here, a hand there, a face half hidden. The work was meditative, almost holy. Tomas lost himself in it, forgetting even hunger. Layer by layer, the saints re-emerged from their tomb of time. But by the third day, he began to notice something odd. Beneath each layer of paint, there was another, not quite the same. The faces beneath were not serene but contorted, as if caught mid-scream. And when he worked late into the night, under lamplight, he could swear their expressions shifted with every blink. Once, while scraping at the corner of a halo, he uncovered a faint inscription, barely visible. He leaned closer. The words were Latin, but strange. Qui pinxit, hunc, intra. He translated automatically. He who painted this enters. A chill went through him. He rubbed the back of his neck and forced a laugh. Superstition, he said aloud, as though the empty chapel needed convincing. Yet, from somewhere deep in the wall, perhaps behind it, came the faintest echo, like the drag of a brush against wet plaster. He turned sharply. Nothing. Days became weeks. The storm outside grew worse. The sea turned violent, throwing spray against the chapel windows. Villagers stopped coming to deliver food. The road had washed away. Tomas didn't notice. He worked by candlelight now, sleeping little, his reflection in the glass growing paler by the hour. One evening, as he cleaned his brushes, he noticed his hands were stained with crimson that wouldn't wash off. He frowned, tried vinegar, then oil. Still, the red clung to his skin like sin. When he returned to the wall, the saint's eyes seemed brighter, no longer dull pigment, but glimmering wetness. He leaned in close to study them and realized, to his horror, that the color of the pupils matched exactly the stain on his fingertips. He stepped back. The air had changed, thicker, humming. The candle flickered, though there was no draft. Somewhere beneath the altar, something dripped rhythmically, as though from a height. Tomas forced himself to look away. "The damp," he whispered, "just the damp." Yet, when he turned toward his palette, he found a single, fresh print of a red-stained finger across it, long and deliberate, as though guiding him toward the next section of wall. He worked until dawn. He had to. The mural demanded completion. By the 7th week, he no longer remembered the sound of the sea. All he heard now was the brush against stone, the faint hiss of pigment meeting plaster, the heartbeat behind the wall. He began speaking to the saints as he painted. They seemed to listen. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still hear them whispering, faint and mournful, like old friends calling from the deep. That was when he first saw his own face among them. It was in the background, half hidden beneath the halo of Saint Morwen herself, faint but unmistakable. His eyes, his mouth, his tired lines. For a long time, he simply stared. Then, trembling, he lifted his scraper. As he peeled away the paint, he found another face beneath, again his own, but younger. Then another and another. Every layer, every century, every restorer, him. Tomas stumbled backward, heart hammering. He turned toward the door, but the chapel had no door anymore. Only blackness, vast and open, filled with the sound of waves. He blinked, disbelieving. His brushes clattered to the floor. The sea had come inside, and in its reflection on the wet stone walls, the saints smiled. That night, Saint Morwen's chapel was seen burning from the village below. The flames were green and blue, the colors of paint. By morning, only the stone remained. The storm washed the rest away. No body was ever found. But sometimes, when the sea mist rolls up the cliffs, you can still hear the faint scrape of a brush against wet plaster. And if you press your ear against the chapel stones, you might hear a whisper. Every masterpiece demands a soul. The saint's eyes, when morning came, the chapel was breathing. Tomas woke to the sound of his own heartbeat echoing through the nave, a slow, damp pulse that seemed to travel along the walls. Mist hung thick inside, curling around the pews like incense. He rose from his cot and stood in the gray half-light, his breath showing in the chill. The ashes from the night's fire were still warm, though he had no memory of tending them. He crossed to the mural. The saints looked back. In daylight, they were almost gentle faces, serene beneath cracked halos. Robes dulled by centuries of salt and soot-butt when the clouds drifted over the high window. Shadow slid across the wall, and the eyes of the painted saints deepened. They caught what little light there was and held it like wet stones at the bottom of a well. Tomas swallowed. He told himself that the change was only the moisture on the plaster, that pigments swelled and darkened when damp. Yet, when he turned away to fetch his brush, he felt the faintest tug of attention, a silence that bent toward him. He worked until his hands cramped. The rhythm steadied him, mix, stroke, breathe. When his knife scraped at old plaster, the sound filled the chapel like the hiss of a whisper. Beneath each flake of decay, new color waited, bruised violets, deep marine greens, gold so bright it seemed to smolder. By noon, he reached the central figure of Saint Morwen herself. Her eyes were downcast, her palms raised in benediction, her mouth soft with pity. But as Tomas cleaned the grime from her face, he felt the hairs rise on his neck. The saint's gaze, once lowered, now met his. He stepped back. The pupils were a shade too dark. He leaned close again, brush trembling, and noticed the tiniest swirl within the pigmentat pattern, not of paint, but of flesh, like a fingerprint. He dropped the brush. It rolled across the floor, tapping against stone. and the sound echoed down into the crypt beneath the altar. The echo didn't fade. It repeated, soft and rhythmic, like someone returning the knock. 3 beats, then silence. Tomas forced himself to breathe. "The air in the vault," he said aloud. The pressure, his voice was dry, absurd in the stillness. That's all. But when he bent to pick up the brush, he noticed a smear of fresh color on the floor. A streak of red ochre, wet and glistening. He hadn't opened the ochre jar that morning. That evening, he lit every candle he had. The chapel flared with trembling gold, shadows dancing like living things along the curved ceiling. He could not bear the dark anymore. The dark listened. He painted through the night. The saints grew radiant under his hand. One by one, their features sharpened, expressions returning from the blur of age. He began to sense intention in their poses, as if each figure leaned subtly toward the next, forming a chain of motion frozen mid-gesture. When he stepped back, the mural no longer seemed flatted moved, a tide of figures turning toward him in solemn recognition. His pulse quickened. He mixed more pigment, desperate to keep working. His brush dipped, lifted, stroked. The faces became clearer, the eyes more human. They seemed to shimmer between paint and personhood, hovering on the edge of breath. When his candle gutters finally went out, he did not notice. The wall itself was glowing. He woke the next morning, slumped against the base of the mural, fingers stained black. His shoulders ached. He could still feel warmth radiating from the plaster, like the heat of a body. He looked up at Saint Morwen's painted hand and saw that it had extended half an inch beyond its former boundary, as though reaching toward him. His first thought was madness. His second was awe. He stumbled to the doorway for air. The sea roared below the cliffs, gray and endless. The horizon shimmered under a pale sun. He knelt, gulping wind, and laughed hoarsely until tears burned his eyes. "The damp," he told the gods. "It's the damp." Yet when he returned inside, the air smelled faintly of linseed and iron, his own blood. That night he dreamt of a shoreline painted in shifting colors. Each wave carried faces that dissolved before reaching land. Above them, a woman in a dark cloak stood upon the water, holding a palette instead of a heart. Her voice was the sea's voice. "You mix us wrongly," she whispered. "You take too much light, not enough soul." He woke with his mouth full of salt. The following days blurred. He no longer counted hours by the sun, but by the beating of the surf. He heard it in the walls, in his pulse, in the scrape of his brush. His supplies dwindled. He began grinding stone from the chapel floor, mixing it with oil, adding drops of his own blood when the color dulled. It worked. The hues deepened. The saints gleamed as though newly anointed. Sometimes, as he painted, he caught a reflection in the wet plaster of face standing behind his shoulder. not always the same. Once it was a bearded priest. Another time, a child with hollow eyes. They vanished when he turned, leaving only the echo of a sigh. He spoke to them anyway. "Tell me what you want." From somewhere within the wall came the faint scrape of a reply, a brushstroke returning his call. On the 10th week, a fisherman found his way up from the village, bearing a loaf of bread and a letter from the bishop. The man called from the door, hesitant to enter. "Master Valen," he shouted over the wind. Tomas emerged from the shadows, gaunt and dusted with pigment, eyes fever bright. The fisherman flinched. "You're bleeding, sir." Tomas looked down. His sleeve was slick with red. He smiled vaguely. "Only vermilion." The fisherman set the loaf on a step. "They say we must fetch you home. The storms worsen. The bishop sends word to abandon the work." Tomas's gaze drifted toward the mural. "Abandon." He laughed softly. "I can't. They're nearly finished." "They?" the man asked. "The saints," Tomas said. "They watch over me." The fisherman glanced toward the wall and saw, or thought he saw, the faintest shimmer of movement, a dozen eyes gleaming from the darkness. He backed away, muttering a prayer. "You should come down before nightfall." Tomas turned fully toward him then, and the man saw that the whites of his eyes were no longer white, but tinted gold, reflecting the candlelight. "Nightfall," Tomas murmured, "is when they breathe." The fisherman fled. When the door closed, silence settled again. Tomas stood before the mural, trembling with exhaustion and devotion. "They don't understand," he whispered, "but I do." The saints looked back, eyes shimmering like trapped stars. Saint Morwen's painted lips parted, so slightly that Tomas might have imagined it. From within the wall came a sound like air escaping a lung. He lifted his brush, dipped it into the darkest pigment, one he hadn't mixed himself. A black so rich it seemed to absorb sound, and began painting over his own reflection in the window. The surface rippled, liquid. He saw, for an instant, his image sinking, color bleeding outward like ink in water. When he stepped back, the window was clear again, but in the mural, a new figure had appeared among the saints. A man with his back turned, brush raised, halo faintly forming behind his head. He slept no more that night. By dawn, the waves had reached the cliff's base. The sea was climbing, as if drawn toward the chapel by the same gravity that bound Tomas to his wall. Each gust of wind sounded like distant chanting. The plaster dripped, the colors ran, and yet the images remained perfect, unmarred, living. Tomas worked until his hand bled, then switched to the other. He could feel something pulsing behind the stone now, a slow, deliberate heartbeat that matched his own. Every time he blinked, the world swam. He no longer knew whether he was standing on the floor or inside the wall itself. He pressed his palm against the mural. The surface was warm, pliant. For the briefest moment, he felt fingers press back from the other side. He should have fled. Instead, he whispered, "Show me." The wall breathed in. That night, the storm came. Rain lashed the glass. Wind tore at the roof. Lightning flashed through the nave, illuminating the mural in bursts of living color. With each strike, the saints moved tiny shifts of hand and gaze, like frames of a nightmare. Their eyes no longer followed him. They led him, guiding his brush toward the center where Saint Morwen waited, patient and merciful. Tomas painted as thunder rolled overhead. He did not notice the water seeping through the floor, the tide rising to his knees. He painted faster, desperate to finish before the sea claimed him. When at last he touched the brush to the saint's heart, the chapel went silent. The next flash of lightning showed a blank wall. Only the echo of waves remained, and a single whisper curling through the hollow space. Every masterpiece demands a soul. The faces beneath the plaster, the morning broke gray and trembling, a mist spilling off the Cornish cliffs like breath from the sea itself. The chapel of Saint Morwen crouched in the fog, its stones black with centuries of salt, its windows clouded by the weight of storms long past. Tomas arrived at dawn, as he always did, though dawn in this forsaken corner of the coast was little more than the dim lifting of shadow. He carried his paints in a wooden chest, the hinges rusted, the smell of linseed and copper pigments rising from within like incense. He paused at the chapel door, tracing the deep grain of the oak with his fingertips. Once, this had been a place of faith. Now it felt like a wound the sea refused to close. Inside, silence waited, thick, damp, and alive. Each footstep echoed faintly, swallowed by stone and salt. Dust drifted in slow spirals through the weak light that filtered from a high-slit window. And before him, the murals loomed, faded saints, halos dulled to the color of ash, their faces half consumed by mold. Tomas set down his chest and pulled out his brushes. Their bristles, though cleaned nightly, were stained with a strange greenish tint, a residue no washing could remove. He told himself it was from the pigments, but sometimes, when he lifted them close to the light, he could swear they pulsed faintly, like veins beneath skin. He began by scraping. Each stroke of his blade peeled away flakes of plaster, and beneath them, faint lines emerged, hands, windows. But there was something else, too, something hidden deeper, like a whisper caught between breaths. And then, as the morning light thinned, Tomas uncovered the first face. It was not a saint. The expression twisted, mouth open in a silent scream, the eyes wide and wetly alive. The pigments shimmered as though still fresh blood and ochre and smoke. The features were human, but not quite, too familiar to knowing. And in the faint tilt of the jaw, Tomas recognized something he could not bear to name, his own reflection. He stumbled back, his knife clattering to the floor. The echo rolled through the chapel like thunder trapped in stone. Tomas stared at the wall, but when he blinked, the face had softened. The scream had faded into the vague, noble calm of a saint again. The sea wind howled through a crack in the glass, carrying the faint smell of rot and salt. He told himself it was exhaustion. The light deceives, the eyes strain. But even as he packed his tools and left that evening, he could feel the weight of that painted gaze following him. Through the chapel door, across the moor, all the way to his lonely cottage, where the sea clawed endlessly at the cliffs below. That night, he dreamed of color, not ordinary color, but something living hues that breathed and bled and whispered. He stood in the chapel once more, but the walls pulsed like lungs, and from beneath the plaster, faces pressed forward, men, women, children, all crying in silence, their mouths filled with salt water. He woke to the sound of his easel tipping over. The candles were still burning, though he could not remember lighting them. The air reeked of linseed and sea brine. On the wall of his cottage, painted in hurried strokes, was the same face he had uncovered in the chapel, his own. Only this time, its eyes were closed, and painted above them in crimson were the words, "You cannot paint over the truth." The following morning, Tomas returned to Saint Morwen's chapel, his body trembling with cold and dread. He brought no food, no coat, only his tools. The sea was rising again, clawing at the rocks with a kind of fairy hunger. He pushed open the chapel doors and stopped. The mural he had been working on was no longer as he left it. The saints stood taller, their robes brighter. Their halos glowed faintly gold, though no sunlight touched them, and each one of their faces had changed, subtly, imperceptibly. The lines of the jaw, the shadows beneath the eyes, they looked more human to human. He leaned close and saw beneath the thin brushwork of centuries that faint texture again, skin, real, painted with such precision that he swore he could see pores, freckles, even faint hairs caught in the varnish. And there, hidden in the corner of the fresco, was a small inscription, carved, not painted, a soul for a saint. Days passed in a blur of salt, prayer, and paint. Tomas worked without sleep, desperate to finish what he'd begun. Each evening, he painted over the faces. Each morning, they returned. The villagers began to whisper again. They said they saw candlelight flickering through the chapel windows long after midnight, that they heard humming, low, mournful, and not quite human. They said Tomas was painting with something other than pigment, and perhaps they were right. One evening, as the sea raged outside and the wind screamed through the chapel roof, Tomas's brush slipped, slicing through his skin. Blood welled up, bright and startling. Without thinking, he wiped it on the wall. The crimson spread through the paint like fire, through oil, and the mural moved. A shudder passed through the stones. The saints turned their heads, their eyes glimmering, and one of them, the one closest to him, opened its mouth. Tomas staggered back, the brush falling from his hand. From within the painted lips came a whisper, dry as old paper. "You are almost finished." He fled that night, through the rain and the salt, to his cottage by the cliff. He barred the doors, but the sound followed him, soft at first, like wind against wood, then clearer, pages turning, brushes scratching, voices murmuring in a language he had once heard only in dreams. When dawn came, he was still awake, staring at the unfinished canvas before him, the same face, the same hollow eyes. Only now, as the morning light caught it, he saw that the paint had dried into something too textured, too organic. It looked like flesh. By the seventh night, Tomas had stopped eating. He painted with shaking hands, muttering prayers to saints whose faces he no longer trusted. His skin grew pale, translucent, as if the colors were draining from his body to feed the walls. The chapel itself seemed to pulse now, the plaster slick with condensation, the air heavy with a strange warmth. When Tomas leaned close to his mural, he swore he could feel a heartbeat beneath it, and then he heard it, faint, rhythmic, echoing from behind the fresco. Thump, thump. He pressed his ear against the wall. The heartbeat grew louder. The plaster cracked slightly under his touch, and from within, a faint sigh escaped, wet and human. He stumbled back, gasping. The saints stared down at him. Their painted lips curved ever so slightly into smiles. Tomas dropped his brush. Outside, thunder rolled across the cliffs. Inside, the chapel walls began to breathe. He knew then what Saint Morwen had warned of in the ancient manuscripts, the price of divine art, the cost of eternal beauty. Every painter left a piece of themselves in their work. But here, in this chapel, the work took more than inspiration. It demanded being. As the rain hammered against the roof, Tomas fell to his knees. "Take it," he whispered. "If it's my soul you want, take it. Just let me finish." And the walls answered. A single voice, layered with hundreds beneath it, spoke softly from the plaster. "We already have." When the villagers found the chapel days later, the sea had broken the cliffs. Half the roof was gone. Inside, the murals gleamed as if newly painted, radiant, flawless, alive. But where Tomas had stood, they found only his brushes, stiff with dried pigment, and on the wall, the newest saint's face, still wet with paint. It looked exactly like him. The saint's smile, the sea, was strangely calm that morning. To calm, a mirror of pewter stretched toward the horizon, unbroken except by the faint spirals of mist that rose and drifted like ghosts. The village of Morwen's Reach had never known silence like this. No gulls, no waves, no wind whispering through the rushes, only stillness. And in that stillness, the chapel stood, half swallowed by the storm's wreckage, its spire bowed, its walls gleaming faintly with the damp sheen of the sea's kiss. The villagers, gathered at the edge of the cliff, watched it from afar. None dared approach. It was the old woman, Mara Penrose, who finally spoke. Her eyes were pale and clouded, like sea glass. "He's still in there," she murmured. The men beside her shifted uneasily. "He's gone," said one, his voice brittle. "We searched. There's nothing left." But Mara shook her head. "Not gone," claimed the wind, picked up then just enough to stir the salt grass and carried the faintest scent of oil and pigment, of varnish drying on fresh paint. Inside the chapel, Tomas's masterpiece glowed faintly in the dim light. The saints stood radiant in their niches, their halos bright as dawn. Yet there was something unsettling in their perfection, too lifelike to present. If you looked long enough, their painted eyes seemed to flicker, as if catching light from somewhere within the wall. And among them, near the altar, was one newly finished, a man with soft brown hair, pale eyes, and a tired smile that didn't quite reach his gaze. His hand rested on his chest in silent devotion, though the lines of his fingers looked impossibly real, as if still drying. A plaque beneath the image read, "Saint Tomas, patron of the brush and burden." No one knew who carved the plaque, or when. That evening, as dusk bled into violet, Mora returned alone. She carried with her an old lantern, its glass cracked but still serviceable. The air was thick with brine and decay. The sea lapped below, gentle and hungry. Inside, the chapel smelled of fresh oil and wet stone. She stood before the mural of Saint Tomas now, and held up the lantern. The flame trembled, throwing shadows that danced across the painted face. For a moment, the illusion faltered. The eyes in the painting glistened wetly, like real eyes reflecting firelight. The mouth twitched. "Fool boy," she whispered. "You wouldn't listen." Her voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the vaulted ceiling. Then came the sound, soft at first, a brush dragging across plaster, a sigh, the faint, rhythmic scrape of someone mixing pigment in a bowl. She turned sharply toward the apse, where the shadows pooled deepest. The air shimmered, a subtle distortion, like heat rising from stone. Then, in the half-light, she saw him, Tomas, or what remained of him. He was painting, slow, methodical strokes, his back hunched, his hand trembling slightly. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and dust, but where his skin should have been pale, it now bore a waxen sheen, as though thinly coated in varnish. "Stop this," Mora said softly. "You've done enough." He didn't turn. The sound of the brush continued, soft, dragging, steady. When she stepped closer, she saw that the wall before him was blank. He was painting on nothing, each stroke vanishing into air. Tomas, at the sound of his name, He froze. Slowly, he turned his head. The smile that crossed his lips was not his own. It was the same hollow, patient smile worn by every saint on the chapel walls. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice soft and echoing, not from his mouth, but from everywhere at once. "I came to help," Mora said, though her voice quavered. He dipped his brush again, though the bowl before him was empty. "You can't help," he whispered. "They've taken the color from me, but they want more, more." He turned his eyes to her, then eyes that were no longer eyes, but a glaze of deep amber resin reflecting her face. "You see, the saints must be fed." She took a step back, the lantern shaking in her grip. "Fed." The air around her thickened. The murals, the saints, began to move. Not much, not like the living, but subtly. The tilt of a head, the shift of a hand, the flicker of a smile. And then came the whispering. A chorus of dry voices, like paint cracking on parchment. "Join us. Stay. We remember you." Mora, Penrose, her name echoing through stone. Mora stumbled backward, clutching the lantern. "I won't," but her foot slipped on the damp flagstone. The lantern flew from her hand, shattering. The oil spilled across the floor, catching the flame. Fire roared up in a circle around her, golden and hungry. Tomas stepped through it, untouched, his varnished skin gleaming. He reached out a hand, stiff, trembling, fingers lacquered and cracking at the joints. "You don't understand," he said. "The paint, it needs to dry." The fire grew higher, licking the saint's feet, and then, impossibly, the murals began to bleed. Thick rivulets of color ran down the walls, crimson, ochre, cobalt. The painted saints wept pigments as though their divinity were melting away. The chapel filled with smoke and color and prayer. Mara screamed once as the light swallowed her, and then there was only the sound of brushes moving again, faster, more frantic. When the flames died, the chapel still stood. The murals were untouched. Not a single stone scorched. But a new figure had appeared among the saints, a woman, her face serene, her hands folded in prayer. A faint glimmer of firelight caught in her eyes. Her plaque read, "Saint Mara, Keeper of the Flame." Weeks passed. The villagers stopped speaking of the chapel altogether. It was said that at night, when the wind came from the sea, you could still hear the sound of brushes scraping plaster. Others said if you dared light a candle near the ruins, it would flicker blue, the color of Tomas's eyes. One fisherman swore he saw him once, standing on the cliffs as the tide came in, holding his paint box, staring at the horizon. When he blinked, the figure was gone, but a faint scent of linseed oil hung in the air. Far below, in the chapel, the saints watched in silence. Their faces shone, their eyes gleamed, and deep within the plaster, something shifted, the faint rhythm of a heartbeat, slow and eternal. The saint's smile glowed faintly in the moonlight, and if you looked long enough, it looked back. The chapel that dreamed of color the sea had returned to its rhythm, slow, relentless, eternal. Days passed, or perhaps weeks. The village no longer kept track. The world beyond Saint Morwen's cliffside seemed to hold its breath. No one dared cross the salt path that led up to the chapel anymore, though its silhouette still loomed, watching. At dawn, the light touched its windows and turned them the color of blood and honey, but no birds perched there. No ivy crept further. It was as though the chapel itself refused decay. It waited. Inside, the air was thick with silence. Dust floated like slow snow, and the walls shimmered faintly as if exhaling color. The murals, once static, now changed subtly with each sunrise. Faces that had smiled one day frowned the next. Eyes shifted direction. The saints seemed restless, their painted robes stirring as though moved by invisible wind. Beneath their feet, the flagstones pulsed faintly, and in the heart of that sleeping chapel, something was painting. A brush moved across plaster, a faint, steady rhythm, the heartbeat of devotion and madness intertwined. Tomas still worked, though he no longer slept or spoke. His skin was pale as wet marble now. His hands cracked with pigment. When he breathed, it was shallow, slow, as though each breath was borrowed from the paintings themselves. He worked by candlelight, and the flame never seemed to die. Each night, he painted new scenes, strange, dreamlike visions that had never been part of Saint Morwen's legend. Storms of gold, oceans filled with angels that wept salt, a saint holding a mirror that reflected not her face, but the face of whoever gazed upon it. And always, in the corner of each painting, the same faint signature, TV in blood-red pigment. It was on the 7th night that the dream began. Tomas awoke, though he was uncertain whether he had ever truly been asleep. The chapel was dim, and yet full of a dull, greenish light that seemed to leak through the walls. He rose, his joints stiff, and found his brush already wet with color. The wall before him was blank. The plaster shimmered like water. When he reached out to touch it, his fingertips sank slightly into the surface, not through, not breaking it, but as though touching skin that yielded and sighed beneath his touch. And from the wall came a whisper, "Paint." He hesitated. "What do you want me to make?" "Color. I have given you color," he murmured. The saints, the sea, the light, the voice deepened, vibrating through the stone. "More? Give us what we have forgotten." "What have you forgotten?" Silence. Then the color of the living. Tomas staggered back. "No, I won't." But his body betrayed him. His hands moved on their own, dragging the brush across the wall. He painted quickly, feverishly, as if guided by something unseen. Lines and shapes formed beneath his trembling fingers. A face, not divine, not saintly, a woman's face, her hair coiled like smoke. Her eyes were deep and sad, the eyes of someone who had once been kind. When the painting was complete, Tomas dropped his brush, his breathing quickened. It was Mara. He fell to his knees, the candlelight flickering wildly around him. The painted Mara blinked once, just once, and smiled. Then, as though the wall had inhaled, the image shifted, her painted lips parting slightly, her breath fogging the plaster. "Tomas," she whispered, "you promised to set us free." The next morning, a traveler arrived at the village, a merchant from Truro, lost on the cliffs, seeking shelter from the fog. He was shown to an empty cottage by the innkeeper's wife, who warned him not to venture toward the chapel after dusk. He laughed. "A church is the safest place for a man in storm." But when night fell and the wind carried the sound of faint bells from the sea, curiosity overcame him. He followed the cliff path, his lantern swaying like a small star in the mist. At the chapel's door, he paused. The air smelled faintly of oil paint, sweet and heavy. He pushed the door open. It groaned. Inside, the candlelight flickered across walls that shimmered like wet glass. The murals were magnificent, saints and angels alive with impossible light. He approached one of them, raising his lantern. "By God," he whispered, "it's as if they breathe." And indeed, they did. The chest of each saint rose and fell, almost imperceptibly. The fabric of their robes rippled, as though caught in a silent wind. His hand trembled. He reached out, brushing his fingers across the cheek of one angel. It was warm. He stumbled back, dropping the lantern. The glass shattered. The flame flared and went out, leaving only the faint phosphorescent glow of the walls themselves. Then came the sound, brushes, dozens of them, moving in perfect unison. He turned and saw Tomas standing before the altar, his face half in shadow, his hands stained to the wrist. "Good evening," Tomas said softly. The merchant swallowed. I'm sorry. I didn't mean you came to look. I meant no harm." Tomas tilted his head. "They all say that." The walls behind him seemed to shimmer and shift, the painted figures moving like the tide, faces leaning forward from the plaster. The air was thick with pigment, heavy and metallic. Tomas stepped closer. His eyes gleamed faintly in the green light. "The chapel is dreaming," he whispered. "And you, my friend, have wandered into its sleep." The merchant turned to run, but the doorway was gone. In its place was a blank expanse of wall, smooth and pale. He screamed, pounding at it, leaving smears of blood where his fists struck. The saints watched, their expressions mournful, almost pitying. Tomas dipped his brush into a pot of deep crimson and walked toward him. "Be still," he murmured. "The color will not take long to dry." By dawn, the villagers found the merchant's horse wandering the cliffs, reins dragging, eyes wide and wild. they never found the man. But when the fog cleared, a new mural adorned the chapel's western wall. A man kneeling in terror, a lantern at his feet, his eyes wide, his mouth frozen mid-cry. The plaque below read, "Saint Theodoric, the one who wandered too far." In the days that followed, the chapel's colors grew more vivid. The saints gleamed like living things, and at night, from the cliffs, a faint light could be seen glowing through the windows. Not firelight, not candlelight, but something deeper, like the sea remembering the sun. The chapel was dreaming indeed, and in its dreams it painted pigments of the soul. The rain had not ceased for 7 days. It came in sheets, relentless and cold, hissing down the cliffs of Saint Morwen, as though the sea had risen to reclaim what was once its own. The villagers no longer looked toward the chapel. They nailed their shutters, muttered their prayers, and burned salt and rosemary on their hearths. Even the priest had stopped ringing the morning bell. Only one soul still moved freely between the storm and the stones. Tomas Valen, whose name was no longer spoken aloud. He worked without pause. He painted without end. The chapel's interior had changed beyond recognition. Every inch of wall, pillar, and archway was covered in color, layers upon layers of saints, faces, and visions overlapping one another like dreams stacked through centuries. The air reeked of linseed and blood. The floor was slick with spilled pigment, a mosaic of reds and blacks that never dried. The saints seemed to breathe more easily now. Their eyes had grown deeper, brighter, aware. They watched him from every wall, hundreds of faces, their gazes gentle, pitying, and cruel all at once. And in their midst stood the altar, now bare, except for Tomas's tools, brushes, jars, and the ancient pigments he had mixed himself from minerals and secrets. He no longer needed to grind ochre or crush lapis. The colors came when he asked for them. They rose from the very stones, a trickle of blue from the wall, a pulse of red from the cracks in the floor. The chapel was alive, and it fed him inspiration in exchange for something he could not name. One night, as the rain thrashed the windows, Tomas awoke at his table. His hand was still clutching a brush, his fingers stiff with dried color. The candle beside him had long since guttered out. The only light came from the walls, which glowed faintly, like embers buried beneath ash. He turned toward the northern wall, the oldest part of the chapel, where Saint Morwen herself had once been painted. But the face that met him there was not hers. It was his. His own eyes stared back at him, painted in painstaking detail, gleaming with a wetness that seemed alive. His likeness was immaculate, down to the scar on his left cheek and the slight crook of his nose. A whisper stirred behind him. "Now you see." He spun around, brush raised like a weapon. The chapel breathed a long, slow exhalation. The candles, long dead, flickered to life again with cold blue flame. "You've painted yourself," the voice said, echoing from the walls. "No," Tomas rasped. "I didn't." "Then who did?" He stepped closer to the painting, trembling. The eyes followed him, and then, slowly, the painted mouth moved. "Tomas," it whispered, "what are you made of?" He backed away. "Stop it. What are you made of?" He turned, desperate, searching for the source, but every painted saint now whispered in unison, their lips moving soundlessly, the words pulsing through the stone. "What are you made of?" "Paint," he murmured. "I'm paint and dust and sin." The voice grew softer. "No, you are what you have given." His chest tightened, his hands shook, the floor seemed to tilt beneath him. He turned back to his own painted image and saw that the pigment was still wet. The color shimmered faintly, alive. He reached out to touch it. His fingers sank into the surface, not smearing, not breaking it, but merging with it. The wall was warm, and beneath the warmth, something pulsed, a heartbeat, his heartbeat. When Tomas awoke again, the storm had passed. The air was still, the dawn faint. He stood in the middle of the chapel, barefoot and trembling. His hands were clean, no pigment, no blood. His tools lay scattered at his feet, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The chapel felt lighter, emptier, as though something had been taken from it. The walls seemed dull, drained of their glow. He walked toward the altar, confusion giving way to dread. There, beside his brushes, lay a basin filled with liquid the color of rust. The smell hit him like a memory, copper and salt. Blood. He stumbled back, knocking over a stool. His head swam. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached for his chest. There was no wound, but beneath his skin, he could feel the faint tackiness of drying pigment. His veins burned. He looked down at his arm. Tiny cracks were forming there, as if the flesh itself were drying on canvas. He understood then. The chapel had begun to take from him. Each night he painted, it stole something in return. Color, warmth, life. Every brushstroke drained him, fed the saints, and replaced what it took with pigment. He was being remade. That night, Tomas tried to flee. He gathered what few belongings he had left, brushes, a coat, his rosary, and stumbled out into the fog. The cliffs were slick, the sea booming below. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper his name. He looked back once and saw the chapel glowing faintly behind him, golden light spilling through its cracked windows. The sound of distant chanting rose from within. Av Morwen, Av Tomas, Av Calorum. He fell to his knees, clutching his head. "Leave me," he shouted. The wind stopped, and then a voice, clear and low, drifted through the fog. "You cannot leave. You are our saint now." He turned. Through the mist, the chapel's door stood open, and in its frame stood a figure, not human, not quite divine. A woman, tall and pale, her skin translucent like wet parchment. Her eyes glowed with the hue of gold leaf. Draped in tattered robes that shimmered faintly, she extended her hand toward him. "Who are you?" Tomas whispered. "I am Saint Morwen," she said softly. "The first to give, the first to bleed." She stepped closer, her voice like a brush on canvas. "You have done what no one else dared. You have fed the chapel with the pigment of your soul. And now it remembers." "I don't want to remember," he said, backing away. She smiled. "You have no choice. You painted us all back into being." She raised her hand, and the air rippled. The sea behind him stilled. The sky turned the color of varnish. And Tomas felt something tear loose inside him. A warmth, a pulse, a part of himself. It was drawn from him in a slow, shuddering pull, rising through his skin like vapor. When he looked down, his veins glowed faintly, lines of light tracing his flesh like cracks in old plaster. "Please," he whispered, "let me go." Saint Morwen touched his cheek, her fingers cool and dry. "You are not leaving, Tomas. You are drying." And with that, he collapsed. The villagers found him at dawn, lying by the chapel gate, his skin pale and cold as chalk. They carried him to the inn, where the priest prayed over him. But Tomas did not wake. When they finally dared to bury him, the priest noticed his hands stiff, gleaming faintly with a sheen of varnish. By evening, when the grave was filled, the priest returned to the chapel to offer one last blessing. Inside, the murals shone brighter than ever, and near the altar, among the painted saints, was a new figure, a man kneeling in devotion, brush in hand, his eyes serene and empty. The plaque below read, "Saint Tomas, pigment of the soul." The seaside against the cliffs, washing over the stones. The chapel glowed softly, dreaming of color, and from deep within its walls, faintly came the sound of painting forever. The color that spoke it began, as all hauntings do, in silence. For months, Saint Morwen's chapel stood alone against the Cornish cliffs, its bell unmoved by wind or prayer. The rain came and went, gulls cried over the surf, and the stone walls, slick with salt, whispered faintly in the night. Then one day, the door creaked open. A traveler entered, a woman cloaked in gray, her hands stained with charcoal, her satchel heavy with paper and brushes. Her name was Alara Wren, a painter's apprentice from Penzance. She had come to study the old murals, the last remnants of a forgotten master who, they said, had vanished inside his own work. She had heard the tale of Tomas Valen, of course, the man who restored saints and lost himself among them. But legends, she believed, were often exaggerated, born of fear, embellished by weathered tongues. The chapel was merely a ruin, she told herself, a ruin that had once known beauty. She would find that beauty again. The interior stunned her. The colors had survived impossibly vibrant. The blues richer than lapis, the reds warmer than blood. The faces of the saints looked alive, their eyes luminous beneath centuries of dust. It was as if the paintings had been finished only yesterday. She set down her satchel and touched the nearest wall with reverent care. The surface was cool, yet there was a pulse beneath it, a faint warmth, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a sleeping thing. "Extraordinary," she murmured. Her words echoed faintly through the nave. She thought she heard another echo answer, softer, almost like a sigh. But when she turned, the chapel was still. That evening, she unpacked her sketchbook and began to draw. The candlelight trembled as she worked, capturing the folds of painted robes, the tilt of divine faces. Her pencil scratched softly until it stopped. Her hand froze midway through a stroke. The saint she was sketching, Saint Morwen herself, had changed. In her drawing, the eyes looked serene, benign. But on the wall, those same eyes had shifted, gazing downward, directly at Ela. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, looked again. The eyes remained fixed upon her, and then blinked. Elara stumbled back, knocking over her candle. Darkness swallowed the chapel. The sea roared outside, loud as thunder. And in the dark, something whispered. It wasn't words, at first, only the sound of bristles dragging over canvas, slow and deliberate. Then, faintly, the whisper took shape. "You draw as he once did." Her breath caught. "Who's there?" No answer, only the wet sound of paint being stirred. She fumbled for her candle, relit it with trembling hands, and turned toward the altar. The jars of pigment that lay there untouched when she'd arrived were now open. The brushes beside them glistened wetly. A line of red had been drawn across the floor, curving toward the wall where Saint Morwen stood. Elara followed it with her eyes and gasped. The saint's painted hand now held something new, a brush. For days she tried to rationalize it. Perhaps moisture had warped the plaster, she thought. Perhaps some old paint had bled through. Yet every night more changed. A figure would appear where there had been none. A face would tilt, a smile deepen. The saints seemed to watch her as she worked, whispering faintly from the walls, snatches of words she could almost understand. Sometimes she heard the sea answer them in a low, mournful hum. At last, unable to bear the silence between whispers, she began to speak back. "Who are you?" she asked one night. "What do you want?" The reply came at once, soft and close. "We want to be remembered." Remembered, your paintings. We are what remains when memory refuses to die. The words sank into her like rain into dry earth. She dared to ask, "Who painted you?" He did. Tomas Valen. A murmur swept across the walls. 100 painted mouths moving soundlessly, the faint rustle of parchment in wind. He gave us color, and what did you give him? The answer came like a shiver through the floorboards. Everything. That night, she dreamed of Tomas. He stood before the altar, brush in hand, his face pale as moonlight. Behind him, the saints whispered, their voices woven into the surf. He dipped his brush into a bowl of crimson, turned to her, and said, "Every masterpiece demands a soul." When she woke, her fingers were smeared with red. By the 5th day, Ilara no longer feared the whispers. She worked alongside them, sketching the murals, tracing the strokes, learning their rhythm. The colors seemed to obey her now, rising beneath her brush like breath. When she painted over cracks, they healed. When she added light, the saints smiled. She began to feel Tomas beside her, invisible but constant, his presence guiding her hand, his voice a steady murmur in her mind. She stopped sleeping. She stopped leaving. The chapel was her whole world. But one evening, as the tide crashed high against the cliffs, she noticed something new. Her reflection, faintly visible in the varnish of a painted saint, was beginning to fade. She leaned closer. Her features wavered, blurred, as though she were being seen through water. Behind her, within the reflection, she thought she saw someone else, a man, standing just behind her shoulder. She turned sharply. No one. But on the wall, beside Saint Morwen, there was now another figure, a woman, slender, her head bowed, her hand resting on a brush. The likeness was perfect. Her likeness, she screamed. The sound echoed off the walls, twisting back at her hundreds of painted throats, returning the cry. She stumbled backward, tripping over her satchel, her sketches scattering across the floor. "Why?" she shouted. "Why me?" The murals pulsed with light gold, red, blue, as if blood had filled them again. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, desperate. "We are memory. You are color. We need you." She covered her ears. Stop. But then, from deep within the chapel, from the walls themselves, came one voice, clear and solemn, Tomas's voice. "Every brushstroke costs a heartbeat, Ilara. Every face you restore must come from somewhere. You've given them your image. Soon you'll give them your name." She stared at the murals, shaking her head. No, but already her hands were stiffening, her veins traced faintly with shimmering blue. The pigment had entered her through her pores, her breath, her tears. The chapel was painting her. By dawn, the villagers heard the chapel bell ring for the first time in years. When they entered, they found it empty. No Ilara, no sign of struggle. Only her sketchbook lay open on the altar. A half-finished drawing of Saint Morwen smiling down, and on the walls beside Tomas there was now another saint, her eyes kind, her hands poised mid-brushstroke. Beneath it, a fresh inscription, Saint Ilara, keeper of color and memory. At night, when storms roll over the cliffs, travelers say the chapel glows again. Sometimes, If you stand close enough to the door, you can hear a woman's voice humming softly within the sound of bristles on plaster, of paint finding life. And if you whisper her name, she whispers yours in return. Because every color still hungers for a soul. The choir of painted faces outside, the sea howled. Inside, the chapel of Saint Morwen began to sing. It was a low, mournful sound, not quite melody, not quite moan, a vibration that began deep in the stone and climbed slowly through the nave until it reached the vaulted ceiling. The villagers of Kilmara heard it through their shutters that night, rising and falling with the tide. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers they had long forgotten. They said it was the wind through the cracks. They said it was the sea. They lied to themselves because everyone in Kilmara knew that the sea did not sing, only the chapel did. By morning, the rain had cleared. The cliffs gleamed with salt and mist. A few brave souls, fishermen mostly, their curiosity outweighing their fear, decided to climb the hill and see what remained of the old chapel. Among them was Ewan Kit, a man who had once carved the chapel's pews as a boy, back when the wood was still sweet with sap. Now he was gray-haired, bent, his face as lined as driftwood. But he remembered Tomas Valen. He remembered the painter's eyes, pale, wild, full of stars. He also remembered the smell that had come after the copper temps of pigment that wasn't tea pigment at all. As the men climbed, gulls circled above them, crying sharply. The air smelled of rain and oil, and faintly, faintly, of iron. When they reached the chapel, the door stood open. Inside, all was still, except for the light. It was different now. Golden rays filtered through the stained glass, turning the dust to slow, drifting fire. The murals glowed with impossible vibrancy, every saint alive with color and warmth. Faces looked back from the walls, soft and luminous, familiar faces. Ewan stopped mid-step. His heart lurched. God above, he whispered. That's Maisie. The others turned view. On the wall, beside the painted Saint Alara, was a new figure, a woman with hair like seaweed, her eyes gentle and sad. It was unmistakably Maisie, Ewan's sister, who had vanished a month ago while gathering shells along the shore, and she was singing. Her painted mouth was slightly open, the faintest breath moving through her. The sound was real, low, layered, beautiful. The other men backed away, their boots scuffing the stone. "Let's go," one muttered. "We shouldn't be here." But Ewan couldn't move. He stepped forward, trembling, reaching toward the wall. "Maisie," he whispered. The face on the wall seemed to turn ever so slightly. A tear slid down his cheek. "What happened to you?" Her painted eyes flickered. The faintest crack of sound escaped her lips, a sigh, or perhaps a word. "Join." The color beneath his fingers pulsed warm, as if the wall were breathing. He pulled his hand back. His fingertips came away dusted in gold and red. That night, Ewan did not return home. The next morning, the choir was louder. Not just one voice now, but many. Men, women, children, 100 small breaths threading through one another in eerie harmony. The villagers heard it from the cliffs, from their boats, even from their dreams. By the third day, no one went near the chapel. By the fifth, the light could be seen from miles away. Then came Father Ainsley, the parish priest. He had served in Kilmara for 40 years, baptized, buried, and blessed every soul within 10 miles. But the chapel, he said, had always been an unease in his mind. The church had long disavowed Saint Morwen's order. Too many tales of relics that healed by taking life, too many paintings that wept not with miracle, but with guilt. When the reports came of voices in the walls, Father Ainsley knew he could no longer ignore it. He went alone. The path up to St. Morwen's was slick with moss. The door hung ajar, sighing with each gust. As he stepped inside, his breath caught. The light was dim and golden, trembling like candle flame. The air smelled of wet stone, linseed, and something sweeter, something almost human. The murals were alive. Every saint, every face, moved in slow rhythm, breathing, swaying, their painted robes whispering as though stirred by wind. Their eyes followed him wherever he turned. And then, beneath their murmuring song, he heard a name, Ainsley. He froze. The voice was gentle, familiar. He turned toward the altar and saw her, his sister, his twin, Mara. She had died 20 years ago, lost to fever before she reached her 30th year. But here she was, painted upon the wall, her hands clasped in prayer, her lips parted in song. Tears blurred his vision. "No," he whispered, "you're gone." Her painted eyes shimmered. "You left me to fade," her voice murmured. He did not. He stumbled forward. Who? The painter? Father Ainsley felt the weight of the air thicken, a warmth pressing against his chest. All around him, the choir grew louder, the saints leaning subtly closer, their painted mouths widening. He fell to his knees, clutching his crucifix. In the name of the Father, the Son, a gust of heat silenced him. The cross grew too hot to hold. From the wall behind the altar, a shadow began to spread, a figure forming out of pigment and prayer. Tall, thin, wrapped in the scent of turpentine and salt, Tomas Valen, the painter. His eyes glowed faintly, not white, but the pale blue of dying flame. "Father," Tomas whispered, "why fear what is holy you? You are no saint, I am art," Tomas replied softly. "Art remembers when flesh forgets." He raised his hand, and the brush that had never left his fingers glistened with red. "Would you like to see her again?" Ainsley trembled. "She's dead." Tomas smiled. "So am I." The chapel filled with light. The saints sang louder, 1,000 painted throats, praising, lamenting, hungering. And when the light faded, the chapel fell silent again. Where Father Ainsley had knelt, only his crucifix remained, burned into the floor, its edges rimmed with gold leaf. On the wall beside Saint Alara, a new figure appeared, a man in priest's robes, his mouth open mid-psalm, his eyes turned skyward. By the next tide, the villagers abandoned Kilmar. Those who stayed said that the chapel glowed brighter than ever. The voices within soft now, almost peaceful, as though a choir had at last found its harmony. And among those faint voices, one was always louder, gentle, devout, forever praying. The feast of pigments, it began with color, soft, creeping, impossible color. For a week after Father Ainsley's disappearance, Kilmara sat in uneasy quiet. The villagers who remained avoided the cliffs, keeping to their hearths and candlelight. They spoke in whispers, afraid that even their breath might carry the chapel's tune. But the silence did not last, because one morning, when dawn broke across the horizon, the sea was no longer gray, it shimmered crimson. The fishermen were the first to see it. They stood at the edge of the harbor, speechless, watching the tide roll in every wave, tinged faintly red like diluted wine. When they dipped their nets, they came up stained, and in that red water floated small fragments, flakes of pigment, smooth and glistening like scales. Paint, murmured one man, rubbing the residue between his fingers. It's paint. The smell of oil and iron drifted on the breeze. By midday, the color had reached the shore, staining the sand in wide strokes, crimson, gold, and a deep indigo that looked black from afar. The cliffs, too, began to glow faintly under the sun, their stones slick with sheen as though varnished. From the top of the hill, Saint Morwen's chapel burned with color, alive, radiant, breathing. At night, the villagers saw the light spreading further down the paths, across the fields, into their homes. At first, it seemed harmless. The edges of mirrors shimmered faintly with painted hue, frames brightening, walls softening as though brushed by unseen hands. Children swore they saw faces in puddles, shapes moving behind glass. Then came the dreams. The painter returned, his voice soft, patient, coaxing. "Color is memory," he whispered, "and memory is salvation." Those who dreamed of him woke to find streaks of red on their palms, blue beneath their nails, gold at the corners of their eyes. And once the color touched them, it never washed away. On the third night, Marental, the blacksmith, woke to the sound of humming. It was faint at first, almost mistaken for the wind. But as he rose, the sound deepened, filling his small cottage until every nail, every hinge, every tool vibrated softly. He followed it to his workshop and froze. The walls were moving, not in shape, but in shade. Swirls of color bled through the plaster, gentle ripples of light shifting like breath beneath skin. In the center of the room, his mirror was glowing, surface rippling like water, and in its reflection, he saw the chapel, perfect, distant, beckoning. Not again, he whispered, shaking his head. He'd lost his brother to that cursed place, gone to pray, never returned. But as he turned from the mirror, something within it moved. A hand reached out, pressing against the glass from inside, fingers pale, wet, glistening with pigment. He stumbled back, heart hammering. The hand was followed by a face, his brother's face, but wrong, too still, too smooth, as though carved from painted plaster. "Come home, Marin," the reflection whispered. "It's beautiful here." The mirror began to crack, paint seeping through like blood through a wound. Marin screamed. He smashed it with his hammer. The glass shattered, and so did the light. But when the pieces hit the floor, each shard still reflected his brother's painted face, smiling. By dawn, Marin's cottage was empty. Only a smear of vermilion led out the door. It spread quickly after that. Paintings in the town square began to change, portraits of ancestors turning their eyes to the sea, their smiles twisting faintly. The statue of Saint Morwen outside the church began to weep black tears that dried to shimmering gold. Even the animals weren't spared. Sheep grazing near the cliff came home dusted with pale blue streaks. Gulls flew overhead, leaving trails of glittering pigment in their wake. The chapel's light pulsed with each passing night, brighter, nearer, and then the sound returned, the choir. Only now, it wasn't confined to the chapel. It was in every wall, every mirror, every window pane. The village itself was beginning to sing. By the end of the week, those who still lived in Kilmara gathered in the old mill, the last building untouched by the color. Among them was Iona Red, a school teacher who had refused to flee. She had seen the faces in the glass. She had heard the voices call her name at night, but she could not leave. Not until she understood. "They're not spirits," she told the others. "They're memories, the chapel's swallowing them. All of us." The baker spat into the dirt. "Then we burn it. We end it tonight." But Iona shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple." "Why?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Because it's already here." The group turned and froze. The walls of the mill were glowing. Colors seeped from the grain sacks, rising like mist. Reds and blues and greens intertwining, moving as though alive. Faces began to form within it, faint outlines at first, then clearer, more defined. The villagers recognized them, their mothers, their husbands, their children. Each painted face smiled, serene and waiting. The choir grew louder. The walls began to drip. Iona screamed, "Run!" But the floor had already hardened beneath their feet. No longer wood, but canvas. The air thickened with pigment. Every breath felt heavy, wet. And then Tomas's voice filled the room, warm, kind, unstoppable. Every soul completes the mural. You should be proud. The villagers' cries were swallowed by color. Their skin bloomed into hues, red veins turning gold, eyes glossing with silver. The mill's windows shone like lanterns as night fell, and when morning came, only silence remained. Inside, the walls were dry again, smooth, perfectly painted. A new mural stretched across the mill's interior, a depiction of the village itself. Bathed in eternal light, each villager smiling peacefully among the saints. At the bottom, written in delicate brushstroke, were the words, "The Feast of Pigments." Kilmara remembered. The sea returned to gray the next day. The cliffs stood bare once more. Only the chapel remained, its door open, its colors dim but living, breathing faintly as though satisfied. Somewhere inside, a brush whispered softly over plaster, and if one dared to listen closely between strokes of color and sighs of the tide, one could still hear the faint echo of Tomas Valen's voice, murmuring prayers in a language that no longer belonged to the living. The rest were gone, transformed, absorbed into murals that no one could ever visit. The chapel alone remained. Its light, however dim, still pulsed from the cliffside like a heart beneath stone. Ronan had never believed the stories, the whispers of choir, the flooded colors, the villagers disappearing into art. But on this morning, as he stared through the lantern's glass, the horizon shimmered. The water reflected not the gray dawn sky, but the chapel itself. Walls gleaming, saints alive, and a brush hovering in midair. His stomach twisted. "This isn't real," he muttered. But as he lowered the telescope, he saw it in the waves, shapes moving just beneath the surface. Colors swirled like living paint. Faces appeared. Ilara, Father Ainsley, Marin, all looking up at him with faint, serene smiles. He slammed the telescope down. That night, he climbed to the cliffs again, carrying his easel, brushes, and paints. He had resolved to do what no one had before, to record what he had seen, to paint the impossible, and perhaps, in doing so, find some anchor for reality. The chapel's light glimmered faintly in the fog. As he approached, he felt a tingle in the air, like static before a storm. The door was open, welcoming him. He hesitated. A warning passed through his mind, a voice faint but firm. Every brushstroke costs a heartbeat. Every heartbeat feeds the mural. Ronan shook his head, gritting his teeth. "I'm not leaving without the truth." The villagers appeared within the swells, faces serene but aware, their painted mouths forming faint whispers. Ronan's heart quickened. This is no ordinary painting, he thought. The brush hovered in his hand. He dared to dip it into the crimson paint. As soon as it touched the canvas, a pulse ran through his arm. Warmth, pressure, and a faint heartbeat. His veins tingled with color. The eternal canvas, the cliffs of Cornwall, had grown silent, not because the sea had stopped, but because it no longer mattered. The waves, once wild and unrelenting, now seemed like gentle strokes of a brush across stone. Even the gulls, perched atop jagged rocks, watched without sound, their heads tilted as if they, too, understood what had been painted into the world. Saint Morwen's chapel stood at the cliff's edge, unchanging, eternal, and yet alive. Its walls glowed faintly in the mist, colors shimmering with each pulse of the tide. No one in Kilmara remained to witness it. No one on the mainland dared to approach, but the stories persisted, carried by the wind. Tales of saints who breathed, villagers who vanished into pigment, and the painter who had become one with the eternal canvas. Inside, the chapel was no longer merely stone and plaster. It had become an organism of color, light, and sound. Every wall, floor, and ceiling throbbed with life. The murals shifted subtly, faces smiling, tilting, leaning toward one another, acknowledging a presence beyond the physical. The saints' eyes tracked movements, their painted hands gesturing toward open spaces that had no end. And in the center of this kaleidoscopic world stood Tomas Valen, or rather the essence of him. No longer flesh, no longer merely paint, but a conduit through which the chapel itself breathed. His brush hovered in the air, painting continuously, ever expanding the canvas that held the village, the sea, the cliffs, and the souls of every living being who had crossed the threshold. The last of the villagers' descendants, who had dared venture near, told of the final transformation. They saw themselves reflected not in mirrors, but in the murals, walking alongside saints, painting their own likeness into the walls. Each stroke was a heartbeat, each color a life absorbed. Alara, now fully a saint among them, whispered in the corners of the chapel, "Every soul completes the mural." Every story matters. Every memory lives. Even the lighthouse keeper, Ronan, kneeling eternally at the edge of the painted sea, continued to add waves, cliffs, and sky to the endless panorama. The chapel's choir swelled as if the entire world had become a single instrument, vibrating with color and sound, praising a reality that no mortal could touch. Those brave enough to witness it, or unfortunate enough to become part of it, found themselves drawn inexorably into the murals. Time, place, and identity dissolved, leaving only the act of painting, of remembering, of breathing color into life. It was peaceful, it was beautiful, and it was eternal. Yet beneath the beauty lay a quiet dread, for those absorbed into the chapel never returned. No scream escaped their lips. No hand reached out for help. They existed in a state between memory and creation, forever, part of a world that had no end. The walls whispered endlessly, "We are here, we remember, you will join us." By nightfall, the cliffs, the sea, and the chapel appeared as a single vision to any distant observer. Mist wrapped around the structure like veils, and faintly, the sound of bristles on plaster could be heard alongside the softest chorus of painted voices. They sang lullabies to the wind, stories for the waves, and histories for the sleepless. The chapel had become more than a building. It was a cathedral of memory, a sanctuary of pigment, a mausoleum of light. Each visitor, whether mortal or immortal, contributed their own essence, willingly or not, to the eternal canvas. And when the moon rose over Cornwall, spilling silver across the cliffs and the still-colored sea, a final message etched itself upon the walls, glowing faintly in the mist. Rest, for the stories never end. Sleep, for we shall remember you. The eternal canvas continues to breathe, to sing, to grow. The saints watch, the villagers smile, the painter paints, and somewhere in the hush between waves and wind, you may hear a faint whisper inviting you to listen. Good night, dear traveler. Sleep now, and let the endless histories cradle you until dawn.